everybody. Welcome to episode 54 of the Alexei podcast. And this week, in a break between comedians, we have Andy Beckett. Andy Beckett is a Guardian columnist and also a kind of historian of the post-war era in Britain. And he's just published a book called The Searchers, which is about five socialists, really: Tony Benn, Jeremy Corbyn, Diane Abbott, John McDonnell, and maybe it's four.
Ken Livingstone.
And it's just, if you're interested in Labour history and social history, it's a fascinating read. I forgot to point this out to Andy Beckett, but one of the things about doing podcasts is you can get free books, really. But I had already bought the book, and
oh no, you do mention that.
Oh, do I? Oh,
yeah.
Right.
You made that clear at the beginning.
Oh, did I? Oh,
yeah.
Okay. All right. I didn't realise. All right.
I suppose that's quite a nice thing for an author to hear.
Yeah. I bought his book. Pay for it with my own money. So, let's get on with it. Andy Beckett. Today is Andy Beckett, a journalist, Guardian journalist, and social historian, would you say?
Yeah, I think I can just about get away with that. Yeah.
Although I have to say that if you go to the bathroom, there is a book in there by, I don't know if he's your nemesis, Dave Kinnerston, who occupies perhaps, I think, similar territory to you. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
he's a bit more right wing.
Yeah, I mean, he's doing that mega project, isn't he, of going through British history, in little chunks.
Right, is he?
I mean, I've only read a bit of his stuff. I think he's very good. He's always very friendly when he meets me, but maybe in private he has contempt for my kind of less academic style. I don't know.
It's... I don't know. It's a long time since I've read any of his stuff. I've got Austerity Britain, but you wrote, I think the last thing I read of yours was Promised You a Miracle.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, about the early 80s, yeah.
Right. So that was, about the early 80s and social history, really. So this book that because you're publicist at, who's your publisher? Is it Penguin?
It's Alan Lane, yeah. They're part of the Penguin kind of mega corporation, yeah.
Your publicist was very highly assiduous in pressing me to have you on because she knows that this podcast is the most powerful force on the left. Fuck you, Owen Jones.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I mean, the reputation of the book will be made by this. We don't need the kind of New Left Review consideration. It's all about Tribune, now. This is the moment. No, forget all that stuff. Yeah.
This is what makes or breaks the book. So, it's called The Searchers. I don't know. I mean, which is an interesting choice of title in itself. I mean, tell me what it's about. I mean, I've read it as well. I've read it completely and thoroughly, and we can get into that.
It's about Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott and Ken Livingstone and John McDonnell. So it's about people on the left of the Labour Party since 68, since that kind of like revolutionary year,
right,
up to kind of pretty much the present day. And it's kind of about them as a group of kind of heretics, as I see them. So they're in the Labour Party, but they're often being expelled or about to be expelled. They're kind of pushing at the boundaries of what the Labour Party, that rather cautious institution, is kind of allowed to do.
That's a nice way to phrase it. Yeah.
It's about, so it's not exactly a group biography because there's only a certain amount about their private lives. It's more about their kind of public and political lives. But yeah, it's about what happened to the politics, which I see as kind of starting in 68, which is a kind of left-wing Labourism that's quite forward-looking. So it's not so much the more traditional kind, it's the more sort of socially liberal, identity politics-related side technologies.
I mean, because there was a left of the Labour Party before then, wasn't there? I mean,
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And
people like Eric Heffer, but Eric Heffer was a terrible old dinosaur in many ways, wasn't he? I mean, I met because he was, he was part of my parents' kind of
of course,
and the Liverpool MP,
so of course,
I was around him, and he seemed like a bit of a. And this is complete digression, but there's a bit in, I think, Tracy Thorne's memoir where she talks about, I think she wanted to write a song for the Labour Party. Somehow they find themselves having a meeting with Eric Heffer, who just says, the only good pop music comes from Liverpool, and then storms out, really. But seemed like, I mean, man long dead, but a real kind of left-wing trade union.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not dismissing that, the more traditional side of the party, but I guess partly because the argument the book tries to make is that a lot of what these people wanted has actually come to pass, especially stuff around like, sexuality, gender, race, their attempts to sort of open all those conversations up. I think in lots of ways we're kind of living in that world.
Yes.
Not everybody, but a lot of people are.
Yes, absolutely.
And I guess they're a bit more connected to pop culture. So like Ken Livingstone, for example, grew up in the 60s. In the 60s, he used to sit around with big headphones on listening to Cream, So he wasn't, he was kind of saw the left as being a sort of modern thing with good graphic design and pop music.
Yes, rather than those old Labour dancers.
Not old banners and even then we might get into this, but some of the people in the book, even a bit ambivalent about trade unions, like in favour of them really, but at times butting up against slightly more traditional aspects of trade unionism.
What prompted you to write? I mean, it has to be. Also, I have to say there is obviously a vast amount of work gone into this book. I think so. I mean, so why?
I mean, I've written about politics sort of in books and in The Guardian for a long time, and I've always been quite interested in radicals. And previously, I'd written a lot about the radical right, about Thatcherism, and although I'm very much on the left, I was quite interested in people who challenge the kind of orthodoxy because partly because it's more exciting and also because it tells you stuff about what the orthodoxy is. It sort of illuminates the landscape because the radicals irritate the mainstream.
Right.
So I'd always had that sort of interest. And then when Corbyn became Labour leader, for the first year or so, I kind of didn't pay that much attention because I thought he's basically obviously a good guy, but is this really going anywhere? Is it all a bit old-fashioned? I remember very early on he was talking about reopening coal mines and, it sounded a bit traditionalist.
Right.
And then after about a year of his leadership, or maybe 18 months, when it started to sprout these slightly more interesting, I thought, sort of new ideas about the economy and, just younger people getting involved, on the policy level, not just as kind of activists, I thought, hang on, there's more here than I thought. And this all sounds a bit patronising, but it did take me about a year to really think there's an interesting thing here. And I wrote about it a bit in The Guardian, and then I kind of thought there's a bigger story here. I knew quite a lot about Benn and about the 70s and the 80s and the left then from previous books I'd done. So I kind of thought there's an interesting project here where you can sort of join the dots between this stuff from 68 and the 70s and the 80s to now.
Yeah.
Not least because people like Corbyn have been around in the 70s. So that's kind of where it came from. And then there was a thought from my publisher, why don't you do some sort of instant book about Corbyn when he was leader?
Yeah.
And it was going well. And I kind of pushed back partly because I'm actually not very good at doing things quickly. And also because I kind of thought there will be books like that anyway.
Which indeed there have been.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And some of them are very good, but it's not
Non's the candidate.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great book. But I just thought, what am I going to bring to the party here?
Yeah.
And I guess because I'm a bit more of a historian, I thought I can link up with these other bits of history. And also, I've always avoided writing about the 60s because, I'm 54, so I was born, at the very end of the 60s. But I always felt the 60s sort of loomed too large in the kind of conversation about, the modern world. And I was always obsessed by the 70s.
Well, it's partly, I mean, this is perhaps not what you're saying, but there's also that thing, if you watch kind of popular documentaries, so in the 1960s, everybody was dressed like a bandsman, was wearing a frock coat, and then 1950s, everybody was a teddy boy. In 1970s, and of course, if you look at footage, everybody's like wearing a suit and a raincoat. I mean, in the 50s to 60s, aren't they?
No, absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's what they always get wrong, don't they, in films as well, that they always assume everyone wears the fashions of the day.
Yeah.
And actually, it's about...
And has the furniture.
Yeah, it's like 500 people in Soho, and everyone else, the 60s, for most people, happens in the 70s. Anyway, I'd always avoid writing about the 60s because I thought, I've got nothing new to say. And then I guess this book partly was like, okay, I'm going to have to think about 1968 and all the student revolutions and uprisings and occupations and all that. I'm actually going to have to read about that and think about it because that's clearly the root of this. So it's kind of had a slight forbidden fruit aspect, like the ye olde 60s. I have to now engage with it. And that was really interesting because, of course, 1968, once you look at it properly, is really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've just been... I too am working on a book about politics, really, and I've just been, because I was 16 then, and sort of peripherally involved in the events of that year. And so I've been writing about it as well. And because in a sense it's a cliche, but also you forget just what an extraordinarily different period it was, really. I think.
Yeah.
I mean, so what are you going to
Yeah. And also, I guess it's interesting to write about it in the context of Britain, because the traditional view of 1968 would be, oh, it's all in Paris, and Britain is a sideshow.
Yeah.
It's about 3 people at the LSE and it has no importance. And it's true that, this sort of excitement and disruption in Britain is on a smaller scale, but arguably it has a bigger effect on more of the population long term than it does in other. I did a book event once with someone who'd been in the Baader-Meinhof terrorist group,
right.
No longer a terrorist at this point, I must make clear. And she said Astrid Prohl, she had fled from Germany to Britain in the 70s and had sort of lived incognito in Hackney under an assumed name, and she worked at this factory that made little toy cars,
right.
the Lesney factory, and I used to collect them as a child. So I quite like the idea they might have been made by a terrorist on the run.
I remember the Baader-Meinhof.
Yeah. But anyway, I did this event with her, and she said, coming from Germany, she thought that the radicals in Britain in the 70s and the 60s, the counterculture, were not that ideological, but in some ways there were more of them, and they changed their lives more. So they weren't so much arguing about doctrine, they were all becoming vegetarians, or they were all squatting or whatever. So there was that part. A little bit of the project of the book is, which I think a lot of my books are about, is, Britain is maybe not quite as boring as the traditional view, and politically it's more dynamic and interesting than, and it's to kind of push back against that a bit.
Right. Yeah. I mean, of course there were, I did go to Paris bizarrely in 1968, but also there were the, which are, I think, major events on the formation of the left, in a sense. The modern left is the Vietnam demos of March and October 1968, which are very formative, I think, very formative for me. So.
Yeah, no, those are massive things, absolutely. And, as someone of, slightly younger, when I see a lot of the stuff that's in all the manifestos from 68, it still seems quite modern. It's like people saying, oh, okay, politics can't just be about class. It has to involve, black rights or women or, gay people, or it has to actually have a dynamism sort of visually. And, it can't just be all doer, that stuff, which, people on the left maybe take for granted who are younger, but it's quite exciting to see that.
Yeah, because obviously I was involved in the Marxist-Leninist left, and our graphic style was very much stuck at the time of the day Marx died kind of thing. But, it was an extraordinarily kind of Victorian publications and visual style. Maybe the visual style was sort of stopped dead in about 1920 in the Soviet Union. Usual.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that side of it that's kind of in, although I'm a political writer, I'm quite interested in popular culture. And so I immediately thought this is a politics that has more of that kind of folded into it.
I mean, how's the book? I mean, what do you, what do you, when you embark on it, well, it must be a major project. I mean, what are you hoping for? What's the best case scenario in a sense with a book? And what, I suppose, what do your publishers think as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've done 4 books. I mean, I suppose I never expect that I'm going to write a book that's going to be a kind of bestseller. You might by chance just sort of hit a nerve and, but I don't think that's ever really the aim. I guess what you're trying to do is, without being too pompous, you're trying to change how people think about a period a bit. Not necessarily that many people, but I wrote a book about the 70s when the lights went out. That's kind of a revisionist book about the 70s. Not saying it was all incredible, but saying politically it's quite an exciting time. It wasn't just a dead end. And that book, just to blow my own trumpet blatantly, has been quite influential. A lot of younger activists and a lot of academics now will say, oh, yeah, I read that book and that changed my view of how I think about politics in the 70s. So that's partly what you're trying to do, is to just push back against. Because I think there's a kind of tradition of sort of popular history in Britain.
Well, I actually did I'm a very, as a stand-up comedian, and then I did it on radio, on my show on Radio 4, that I did a bit about Dominic Sandbrook, who to me, I think Clive James before he did describe Dominic Sandbrook, who was, the favoured in many ways popular historian on TV. Clive James described it as him talking about stuff that his mother had told him. And also, when I watched Dominic, everything that, because I was alive during the period he talks about, everything that he talks about is wrong.
Yeah,
I mean, it's subtly wrong.
Yeah.
And it's also because he's also right wing and he's a fucking blowhard. So,
Yeah, I mean,
that's the kind of popular historian that I despise. True to some extent of all them. I mean, Dan Snow and people like that.
I kind of think that, I mean, certainly I won't agree with a lot of the people you're mentioning politically, but also for me, it's like it's kind of greatest hits. It's like we're not interested in any kind of fresh take. It's just like, it's like a jukebox kind of history. Like, let's play the bit that is, the winter of discontent, and we'll have people in donkey jackets and bodies not being buried or whatever. It's that kind of, so it doesn't really yield anything new. And also I think it's often all about looking at it with hindsight. Whereas what I try and do in my books is tell stories fairly chronologically so that people might think this is all going to end very badly, like with Corbyn's leadership. But hopefully if you're reading it, at times you forget that and you just think, what did it feel like for him when it seemed to be going quite well? Because to me, that's a more interesting question.
Yeah.
Rather than constantly tapping the reader on the shoulder saying, oh, no, this was going to end badly, which is a kind of classic trope of popular history, to sort of leave it all quite tidy. I mean, I suppose the other thing I'm trying to do a bit in my books is, although I'm on the left, I do a lot of research, and I kind of want some people at least to read the books who don't agree with me, but still think I'm really glad I read that because there are interesting things in it I didn't know, or even for the reader to sometimes think they're reading a chapter and like, hang on, where's this going? These people are Thatcherites and he's on the left, but they seem to be quite exciting characters. So it's to sort of introduce a bit of instability into the story because I just think it's more interesting to read, and it's more true to the kind of how these things are often experienced. I think that in politics, often the bad people, maybe for 30 seconds, suddenly sound quite exciting. And then you suddenly think, oh no, that's actually Suella Braverman, and I can't agree with her. So
Farage is a monster, but what he said about the war in Ukraine, I mean, it seemed to make perfect sense.
I mean, I wouldn't agree with all of it, but bits of it certainly. So that's kind of the project. It's like, let's try and rethink British history since the sort of late 60s up to now through these various books. And let's try and just, slightly subvert what the established view is and also just find out some stuff, like talk to people, dig around in the archives, because then someone can think your argument's absolute rubbish. But I had no idea that Jeremy Corbyn's first job was working for a union that was nicknamed the National Union of Jewish Stalinists, for example. That's a good thing to know. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a bit, just to describe my own, I was completely uninterested in the Labour Party. And then I think it was the defeat of Jeremy in 2019 and then lockdown that I found myself reading as a kind of therapy in a sense. I read every book about the Labour Party, party with socialists in it. And then I read all of Tony Benn's diaries. I mean, I just read this. I mean, and I've been completely uninterested in the Labour Party before, I never understood the nuance, when people talked in 2015 about how Ed Miliband had the backings of the unions. I was like, or like a friend of mine, their daughter was going out with the son of John Cruddas, and I didn't know who he was. I mean, I could locate John Cruddas precisely between that person and that person. I could say he's a centrist, former, blah 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 blah. Could cite his crimes, and but then I was like, he's a Labour Party MP, drives a Range Rover, Range Rover Evoque. Freelander. But I was suddenly filled up with all these books about the Labour Party. I still quite don't know why, in a sense. But so I am stuffed like a kind of a goose, philosopher goose in a way, with shit about the Labour Party. No, I mean, nevertheless, your book is, the first bit, in a sense. I mean, Benn, for instance, is I've met him a few times. I interviewed him for a radio series I was doing. I never quite talked to him really in many ways. But I read all his diaries, which are fascinating social documents, I think.
And they're quite kind of raw in places, aren't they? And when he's very upset or he thinks it's all a disaster, he kind of says so. He doesn't.
And then he might have felt different the next day, but you're getting the...
exactly. I mean, I think one of the difficulties of the book that I was writing was to not let Benn take it over, because you've got the diaries, and if you're not careful, you end up just that becomes, because he's a decent writer, and and obviously he's a kind of charismatic individual, and I don't want him to totally dominate. But
and they all. I mean, I don't know whether Diana reveres him, but the others.
Yeah, I think she does too. I think. Yeah,
right.
They all do.
I mean, I would demur from that in a way. I was well, and he was also in a sense a tourist, because he's a member of the aristocracy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, and also, I mean, he was a pretty orthodox Labour politician for quite a long time, and then moved leftwards in kind of middle age. So he had quite a long period of just being a pretty standard, almost like the Tony Blair of the 60s, sort of young, charismatic, telegenic guy, not very trustworthy, and then around 68, which is partly why the book starts there, that's when he gets radicalised, because he was an MP in Bristol, and there was what was called a free university, a sort of alternative improvised university set up by students in Bristol. And it was open to anyone to go along in the summer in 68. So this is, I guess, shortly after the May events in Paris. And Ben writes about this and goes along and sort of goes to a class about Black Power and another one about feminism. And, it's like an epiphany. He's like, oh, politics is not just about the trade union conference.
But you're also, I think, not afraid to go to a degree anyway, to kind of consider the psychological dimension, aren't you? I mean, I don't know what to what extent that interests you, because you are, I mean, it's not like preeminent, but you do look at the, well, I don't know, talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think, because one of the things I wanted to answer was, Ben is a little different, but someone like, say, Corbyn was an MP quite young, was kind of going places in his sort of late 20s, early 30s. And then from then until his 60s, still an MP, but basically on the margins. And that's true of the other characters in the book, apart from Ben. Like, how did they cope with having decades and decades where they were sort of marginalised, where they were treated with kind of contempt? Jeremy Corbyn was my MP at various points, and I voted for him, in elections. But I used to think, I was kind of young journalist then. Oh, Corbyn's a kind of well-meaning old duffer. He's an unworldly character. I was probably quite patronising in my view of him.
Yeah.
So in a way, one of the questions the book asks is, how do you kind of keep up these struggles without going completely mad? What strategies do you adopt? And, with Corbyn, one thing I realised from talking to him was that he can be quite funny in private, and he sees his enemies as a bit ridiculous. And that's a very smart defence mechanism. If the Telegraph every day is saying you're a sort of, Stalinist anti-Semite, if you see the Telegraph as a bit ridiculous, which it kind of is, that enables you to. And so I was interested, in the psychology. And then how did they suddenly spring into action, if you like, when they suddenly got this unexpected power? Yeah. What did that do to them? And they're quite relatively late in life, like in their 60s or 70s. So I was interested in that. And I guess, without being too grand, it's kind of about how do people do politics for long periods, full stop. Most readers of the book probably, they vote and or they follow it, but they're not activists for very long, if ever. And, so people think, how do you just go to meetings for like 30 years? And how do you keep that interesting? And obviously lots of people don't, they just drop out. But it's easy to be dismissive of people who are very preoccupied with politics, like the people in the book. But if you didn't have some people like that, democracy kind of wouldn't function. So in a way, it's about the book's about the left, but it's also kind of about just what is it to be political and be obsessed, and what's the cost for you personally if you do that. If you're Ben or Corbyn, how do your relationships?
Well, because Corbyn's second marriage founded on, although they're still very good friends with people. Which you point out, I think. Yeah. But that they founded on his kids' education.
Yeah, exactly. That he wanted one of his kids to go to the local state school, and his then wife wanted them to go to, a school that wasn't the local school.
Yeah.
And they basically broke up, mainly over that. And as you say, they're still, it was all quite amicable, but that's a massive kind of price to pay. Yeah. And I think often, when I remember when that story came out, his wife was interviewed in the Daily Mail, and they were also gleefully covering it as if Corbyn, what a strange fanatic he is, that he's actually allowed his politics to influence how he lived. But then equally, if Corbyn had actually secretly been someone who went shooting, they would have said, what a hypocrite, So again, I mean, without wanting the book to be too much about the media, clearly quite a lot of the book is about how, for the mainstream media, these people on the left are essentially unacceptable, whatever they do. And what's going on there, what are the boundaries of kind of what's allowed within politics? That's kind of a lot of what the book is touching on.
Yeah, and yes, and that is a challenge and almost a fatal flaw in our democracy. I think, particularly the behaviour of the media now. I think in these last, the tolerance has narrowed.
Yeah,
we all know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when Corbyn was leader, the Guardian covered Corbyn pretty critically. Now, Corbyn, was a pretty flawed leader. He's a kind of limited politician, but I think Guardian readers, I know this, were sort of at best evenly split, maybe even majority thinking he's doing a pretty good job.
Yeah.
And yet within the paper, although there were some people writing in support, there were loads of people saying this is all just a disaster. And, that was, I'm loyal to The Guardian. I worked there for a long time, but it made me realise, for a lot of people at The Guardian, there's a limit beyond which Labour leaders are not allowed to go.
Yeah.
And it's not the first time that limit's been identified, but I guess it's the first time recently that's happened.
Yeah.
And obviously The Guardian is relatively plural compared to most newspapers. Most of the press, the BBC particularly.
Yes.
I mean, again, maybe it's naive of me, but I always thought it was really interesting when it was Corbyn against Johnson, that Corbyn would be presented by the BBC essentially as a kind of extremist, and Johnson would be portrayed, Boris Johnson, as a kind of mainstream figure.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you're a Martian, you would think both of these politicians represent relatively radical positions, and Corbyn's obviously a bit more of a serious person. But
better person.
Yeah, absolutely. But the idea that Corbyn was a risk to be potential prime minister and Johnson wasn't. I mean, we see what happened there, don't we?
Yeah, exactly,
and yet the BBC would, Laura Kunsberg and so on, they would present Corbyn in kind of scare quotes, wouldn't they, all the time?
Yeah.
And that was incredibly damaging, I think, because we now know, don't we, in 2019 election, where obviously Labour lost quite heavily, a lot of what happened was a lot of centrists just stopped voting Labour. They either voted Tory or they stopped voting. So a lot of those people who maybe think the BBC is serious were sort of like, oh no, Corbyn, he's a wrong man.
It's a deplorable state of affairs, and I think it's something that is profoundly dangerous for our country. The behaviour of the BBC, the behaviour of the Guardian, obviously the behaviour of all the right wing press is really opens up a kind of very dark view for me personally of the world that we're living in, really.
No,
and you talk
a
bit. I mean, Peter Oborne talked about. I don't know whether it was kind of been on the day of the election, but Peter Oborne. There was a day when Ken Clarke had said, "Don't vote Tory in 2019."
Yeah.
But instead of that, the BBC devoted its entire day. He was there and to this fucking shitbag called Ian Austin. It was on the fucking Today programme in the morning.
Yeah.
And then he was on the fucking Newsnight at the end of the day.
Yeah.
He'd left the Labour Party 9 months before, but for the entire day, the BBC devoted itself to allowing that vile pig-faced bully to go around, saying poisonous, untrue things about Jeremy Corbyn.
Absolutely,
and that you got to think that's fucked up, yo.
No, I know, absolutely. Yeah. And I remember also during the kind of weirdest moments of the Brexit thing, where there was all this talk about, will there be a government of national unity and stuff? I remember the Lib Dems saying, we can't be in any kind of coalition with Corbyn's Labour because Corbyn is sort of beyond the pale.
Yeah.
And you're like, actually, I mean, you could probably articulate this better than me, Alexei, but, on the great spectrum of like left-wing politics, what Corbyn was offering was kind of like left-wing social democracy. It was hardly like a bloody revolution.
Yeah.
Maybe McDonnell might have pushed things a bit further left had Labour won. But really, the offer in the manifestos in 2017 and 2019 was just like a reasonably left-wing version of social democracy. And Benn was the same. When Benn in the 70s and the 80s was constantly being portrayed as a sort of would-be dictator, you're like, hang on, he's been an MP for 40 years. He's in favour of civil liberties. He hates the security services. Is that really a potential Stalin? It doesn't sound like it. But for all these people from the centre-left over to all the bits of the right, they constantly present these people as kind of would-be authoritarians and all the rest of it.
I mean, I did, in one of my few forays into mainstream TV, I did Question Time. Once with Joe Swinson. And it was at that time the leader of Liberal Democrat. I thought she was a fucking idiot. I mean, she seemed like an idiot. So there was that anyway. Although apparently Jeremy quite liked her, but there was also, I mean, the other thing that you talk about, I mean, we're jumping around, I suppose, but the other thing you talk about, which you have to cover, is the I mean, the reason that they could hide behind, I don't think that they did it for that. I don't know whether they believe Jeremy was anti-Semitic or not, but I mean, that's the hill they could hide behind. Wasn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that was incredibly damaging. We know this. And I mean, I've done quite a lot of work in that area because, with a book like this, although I try and keep it to kind of 15, 20 pages, you have to do a lot of work.
Yeah.
And, it's pretty clear from the more independent research into evidence of anti-Semitism across British politics that, surprise, surprise, there are fewer anti-Semites in the Labour Party than other parties because the Labour Party, although not in any way perfect, a lot of people in the Labour Party are quite into identity politics and minorities. And so, funnily enough, they're not anti-Semites.
And there was a bit that really made me sad and angry in your book where you just very intensively detail, before he was leader, before he was at all known, all the challenges to anti-Semitism that Jeremy Corbyn did, and that, I mean, helping that fucking traitorous Zionist Margaret Hodge, for example, in her fight against the BNP.
Yeah, absolutely. And Corbyn was always sponsoring these early day motions in the Commons against anti-Semitism. He did it from when he first became an MP in the 80s. He's doing it regularly, almost more than almost any other MP.
Yeah.
And as you say, sending people over to help Margaret Hodge against the BNP. And I mean, one of the things that frustrated me when the controversy was going on was that Corbyn and his people didn't almost just put the list out there and say, look, I'm not perfect, but this is who I am, and
I don't know. I mean, one of the things that you talk, one of the characters who crops up early in the book and then sort of fades away really is John Landsman, really. Mm-hmm. I sort of feel in retrospect, I don't know, that in a way that Jeremy was getting bad advice from John McDonnell and on that matter, and Landsman, really. And Chris Williamson, a figure who's not necessarily liked, but I mean, by many people, but he said McDonnell kept saying to him, just make this one apology and that'll draw a line under it. And of course it never did. Yeah. It never will, because these people are bullies, and you can never draw a line on it, but I mean, Jeremy, I think was being advised to make these constant apologies.
And he made these apologies, didn't he? Yeah. And, I mean, I'm not Jewish, so, I have a certain perspective, but I would read them or listen to them and think often these apologies were quite fulsome. And you're thinking, what's missing here from, and then you realise, as you say, that those people
would never take yes. Right?
Yeah. And also a lot of the Tory press, which had no interest whatsoever in anti-Semitism previously, except in promoting it themselves against Ed Miliband, were, effectively following this in bad faith. They had no interest, just in the same way that, the Tory press now decides that, feminism is a good thing when they can use it to bash trans people, but they were never interested in feminism before. It's a very, and one of the things I get into a bit in the book, which is I found fascinating, was that when Ed Miliband was Labour leader, again, a sort of flawed Labour leader, but there was a lot of anti-Semitic stuff around then. Obviously he's Jewish, and the Tory press used to constantly publish that picture of him eating a bacon sandwich. Yeah. And essentially anti-Semitic dog whistles were being blown. And yet, community organisations did not ride to Ed Miliband's rescue.
No, Maureen Littman made the first. I think she's quit the Labour Party 7 times. Yeah. So that she made the first, and then she said she was never in it in the first fucking place. But she made the first of her. She left the Labour Party over anti-Semitism when the Labour Party was run by Jews.
Yeah, exactly. And it's quite clear that, Ed Miliband's sin when he was leader was to go to the occupied territories and say something mildly critical and have a motion in the Commons that was mildly critical. And a lot of people did not like that. Now, if you've got a very strong view about where Israel's borders should be and they should be bigger, I won't agree with you, but then be upfront about that. But don't, that was my problem with Ed Miliband and with Corbyn, that it felt like people were using the anti-Semitism thing to hide behind.
As we see, I mean, where we are now, it's just a much darker place.
Well, exactly, exactly. So that is in the book, and I found that really painful to write about. But the only way I kind of kept my sanity was there's quite good work done about survey work, focus group work done about the Labour Party and its various iterations in the 2010s, and you quite clearly see that there are not many anti-Semites in it. The House of Commons did quite a good independent report, one of their committees, saying that actually anti-Semitism appeared to go down when Corbyn was leader, in the Labour Party. So all you can do is put that stuff out there. and then hopefully also make people see now the sort of apocalyptic warnings that were given. I mean, saying, again, I'm saying this as a non-Jew, but, the Jewish Chronicle saying, Jews should effectively leave the country if he becomes leader. I mean, really, so that was, I think in the future, people will look back on the episode and think, what was going on there, really? That Corbyn was not perfect, but the idea that he was an anti-Semite.
Yeah. What's his Simon Heffer said, opening up wants to open up the gates of Auschwitz.
Yeah, absolutely. It's extraordinary. And also, if you spend too much time, as I'm sure we both have done, kind of rooting around in bits of the left, you don't encounter a lot of anti-Semitism, because people on the left they've got plenty. Because most people on the left, are not particularly prejudiced. That's partly why they're on the left. No. And also, if you're looking for bogeymen, British capitalism is not run by Jewish people; it's run by white public school boys, who are, et cetera, et cetera. And everyone knows that. So,
So let's go back to a happier time.
Yes, let's do that.
Which is Ken Livingstone's GLC, which in retrospect again is, I'll have to that in a way. And of course it had two iterations really. The original GLC, which was disbanded by Margaret Thatcher. And what is, when you think about it, an extraordinary anti-democratic act, which again our media just sort of accepted really. But then he bounces back again, and it's just, again in retrospect. Well, the point you make, and obviously you want to make, is that of course a lot of, and it's a bit like the Daily Mail, I suppose, supporting Hitler, but the things that they railed against in Ken Livingstone's GLC are now formally accepted. I was on a train going somewhere, and there was Wilf's about to make his usual intervention. There was a load of hoardings for what, Wilf? Cat, he always comes.
Probably suspects that I've got a cat of my own.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and there's maybe my bag, carrying the scent of the enemy. Yeah, possibly.
He always comes, and then you get going again.
He's coming to talk about the GLC.
Yeah,
feline policies.
Got very strong. But where were we? Yeah. What was I talking about? So the GLC, Ken Livingstone.
Hoarding that you saw?
Oh, yeah, I was going past some hoardings.
Yeah.
Like some, Murphy's or something, some construction project. I'm like, it's like they're hoardings. It's just on the side of a railway, with some building. It's just like, working towards mental health, it's like working towards diversity. And you think this is a fucking giant corporation that probably, would build anything for any, but they're like adopting this language, which was considered,
No, absolutely. You look at these leaflets the GLC was putting out in the 80s that were seen, as kind of, in inverted commas, loony. And they're like something you get from a primary school now, from an HR department. Yeah. It's just like, here's a group of kids, different races, different sexualities. Here they are together. It's not, the world hasn't ended. But the GLC at the time, it's pretty unusual for a sort of big city government to be saying diversity is a good thing. And also we're going to give money to minority groups. And one thing that's fascinating is that the local government legislation that had been written by the Heath government in the 70s was very verbose. And John McDonnell, who was working for Livingstone as then, really young, sort of late 20s, running the money for the GLC, basically spotted there were all these loopholes in the legislation. So it would kind of say local government can use, a certain amount of money for purposes as it sees fit, or to publicise its activity. And you'd be like, oh, okay, that means we can give them all, give this money to Somali mothers on an estate in South London. Yeah. So they found, in ways that absolutely enraged Thatcher, ways to get money to minority groups. Those loopholes have all been closed now, but they gave away a lot of money. And also it was a radical thing, because they were saying, if you're a group of Somali mothers, we are maybe not Somali, and so we aren't going to tell you how to spend this money. Yeah. We will help you write a grant application, and you can decide what the priorities are, and then we'll give you the money. And obviously we might check that it's been spent properly, but you get to work out what this is for, which is, again, quite a modern way of doing it, rather than Whitehall deciding. And
also the bigger point you make is that, I always think if you watch, Wilf, no. Mate, can you? Go on. Go downstairs, bro. You've been And then cats intervening a bit too much. All right, I'll lock him out. Yeah, that's a good idea. Come on, Wilf. Well, he's escaped. So that's it. Hey.
I think we need a long kind of cat interlude. I think we need to.
He's under
the table where it's going to be quite hard for you to grab it without him scratching you, probably.
No, he doesn't.
You won't do that, okay. He's huge.
Yeah, he's a Maine Coon.
Maine Coon, nice cat.
Yeah. I'm going to shut this door and the kitchen door.
Hello, valued listener to the Alexei podcast. Talal here, and while Alexei is getting Wilf settled, just thought I'd pop in and remind you the best way to support the show. Look, we give this show out for free, and we're very happy to do that, and we hope never to have any advertisers. So if you can afford to contribute to the Patreon, that would mean a great deal. The price of a coffee, the price of a pint once a month would mean a great deal. And it would help keep the machine running. Head over to patreon.com/alexeisaylepodcast. That's patreon.com/alexeisaylepodcast. There are a few different price brackets you can sign up to and contribute however much you like to the show. That's it. Enjoy the rest of the show. Bye-bye.
So what I was saying was, if you watch stuff on like ITV4, like Minder, or Minder, or what was the bit, the Sweeney.
Yeah,
you see a virtual London. Then it's still bomb sites. Yeah, it's dirty. Yeah, it's and it was Ken Livingstone and GLC that transformed London into a world city. I mean, talk a bit more about that.
I think that's a really interesting aspect of it that I'd not really thought about much until I started doing the book. Was that London, as you're suggesting it, had been sort of in decline in quite a lot of ways from the 30s through to the 80s, industry shutting, population, reducing, a lot of bombed out areas. And the GLC, like on public transport, they made fares much cheaper. And Ken said to me, the reason we could do this is the tube was half empty. So it didn't matter if loads more people started reading the tube, the capacity was there. So the idea was that London shouldn't just be this kind of rather melancholy, atmospheric sort of tourist site. It should be more vibrant. It should have more people in it. It should be more multicultural in its official identity. Right. Clearly by the 80s, a lot of London wasn't white, but the politics didn't really recognise that. There weren't any black MPs. The GLC was white dominated, and the GLC said, in a way, again, we take this for granted, don't we? But the idea that London's quite an important city again, and all kinds of people live there, and the diversity is a good thing, even if you're on the right. That's all kind of taken as read now. And the GLC was really starting that. And Livingstone was a sort of born and bred Londoner and was kind of a London nationalist, and that was part of it. He wanted the city to be. And
he made the buses run. Yeah. I mean, they were more frequent. Yeah. And they also just got places.
Yeah. I mean, a tiny example of that change is that, I can remember this. I mean, I didn't move to London to the 90s, but I used to visit. And I can remember there was a thing, wasn't there, where women were very scared about going on the tube late at night. Yeah. And I'm not saying that fears disappeared completely, but of course the understanding was I might be in an empty tube carriage with some nutter. Whereas now, the tube carriage will be full.
Of nuts.
Well, possibly. But, so it doesn't mean there's no, the problems. But, it's a different thing, that they had this whole system that was run down. And, I've become a bit of a London nationalist myself. So although I understand London's like too dominant and all the rest of it, when there's that conversation about how London gets all the good stuff, people forget that, between the 30s and the 80s, London got very little.
I remember there was this thing when I was called the Relocation of Offices Bureau, which was this government organisation to designate, which was to move business out of London. Yeah. I used to think even that, what the fuck, why are you doing that? I mean, why have you got what the fuck?
No, I agree. It's kind of bizarre. They were like moved to Milton Keynes or moved to sort of Buckinghamshire or something. Yeah, absolutely. That was all going on. And so, the GLC were partly about reversing that. And obviously when Livingstone then became mayor, in a way that was kind of part two of that project, and bits of what he did as mayor, I'd be less comfortable about, like, let's make the City of London as big as possible. But if you
problematic, particularly in his second reign, I think.
But the ideology behind that when he was mayor was we can't distribute wealth in London because we're not allowed to as mayor. So what we can do is make the city as big and as rich as possible, and therefore people at the bottom will get some benefit. Now, we can argue about whether that was the right approach, but that's essentially what the plan was.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that's really interesting, the way that the GLC, again, if you see GLC descriptions of what they wanted London to become, it sounds like a reasonably vibrant part of London now. You know, let's have lots of cycling, let's have recycling, let's have better public transport, let's keep cars on the fringes, let's, you know, celebrate.
What did Thatcher do?
She abolished the GLC. There's a great quote from Norman Tebbit, who was obviously, you know, probably the most charming member of the Thatcher government, you know, in around 83, 84, where he basically says, I'm paraphrasing, but he kind of says, you know, the GLC has created a new version of socialism, therefore we must abolish it. You know, so he, you know, because Tebbit is a smart guy and recognised this isn't just some old-fashioned thing. Livingstone has got this thing going on here that is a threat. And the GLC under Livingstone initially were very unpopular, but by the time he was getting towards the end when it was going to be abolished, you know, a lot of quite right-wing Londoners liked Livingstone because they thought, well, he's a good representative of the city and all the rest of it. So, they shut it down basically because
it was true, because it worked.
It
tells you a lot about our so-called democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, again, we go back to this question of the sort of boundaries being policed of what's acceptable. You know, the GLC being basically created by the Tories, the institution. The Tories had run it at various points, and yet as soon as there's a radical left-wing person running it, we just abolish the institution. And then London basically had no government.
It's not just that the radical run it, but it's actually, it's making a better world.
Yeah. And this is a time, you know, in the mid-'80s we're talking about, when Thatcherism was dominant in a lot of the country. So Livingstone was the one person, you know, within, you know, outside the trade union movement anyway, who was really giving her headaches. And the GLC again had, you know, amazing posters, and, you know, a lot of clever people were drawn to work for the GLC because, oh, that's where the action is. So again, it's quite a modern politics. You know, the GLC would have these massive festivals on the South Bank, and they would have, you know, the Smiths and the Pet Shop Boys and all these bands playing. And again, they were the kind of template for like what Glastonbury is now, essentially. It was the same guy who I interview in the book who essentially organised the festivals for Livingstone, who also modernised Glastonbury.
Oh, really?
And it's all about intertwining kind of political messaging with entertainment and doing it in a way that's not boring.
Right.
So again, that's quite a modern, you know, and it has its pitfalls, but that was, you know, again, you see footage of those festivals and you think that just looks like a modern festival, and yet it's from 1984, you know.
Yeah. I mean, to switch tracks in a way, I mean, these people that you've spent how long did the book take you to write?
Probably the writer. I mean, I do a kind of Guardian column in parallel. So probably I spent about 4 years working on the book, but I was collecting bits and pieces for it for a long time before then. You know, like I spoke to Benn when he was still alive. I mean, Ben died 10 years ago, you know, so I don't think at the beginning I thought I'm going to write a book about this, but I was just picking stuff up because I thought it was interesting.
So you spent a long time with these people. Do you like them?
I like some of them. Yeah. I mean, what can I say?
I mean, it's not, I'm not.
Yeah. I mean, Benn, you know, by the time I met him, which was in the 90s, he was kind of a sort of, you know, what was Benn and what was the kind of Benn public persona were hard to sort of differentiate.
I also think that is a flaw in the left, is excessive reverence. I think that people hear it with too much, and that affected him.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Corbyn, when I've met him, I've liked him because he's been a bit cheekier than I was expecting.
Yeah, and he's actually not affected in the same way that Benn was by all that adulation, doesn't sort of rose.
No, I think that's quite, I don't think it's false modesty. That's genuinely the case. I think that's right. You know, McDonnell, you know.
Yeah, I liked him at first because he reminded me of my dad, really. But
yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. McDonnell, I mean, I've met him quite a few times, and I've always thought with him that, you know, obviously in his kind of senior statesman persona, he's very courteous and sort of mild-mannered. Obviously, when he was younger, he was much fiercer. But I like him because he's very thoughtful, you know, and you'll go to some lefty event, there's nothing to do with McDonnell, and McDonnell's there at the side of the stage, like, taking notes, you know, and I like that. Right. That sort of autodidact, like, he's really interested. And he's not there because some people say, oh, it's John McDonnell. He's just like, oh, this is an event about, I don't know, you know, universal basic income or something, and I'll turn up. So I like his kind of curiosity. Diana, but she's my MP, and you know, I've lived in Hackney in her constituency for ages, and I mentioned this in the book. A lot of people locally who are Labour voters, Labour members, will say she's a bit of a nightmare. her. She's very difficult to deal with. She's so grand. There's a lot of noise about her being difficult. And I think some of that I feel uncomfortable about because she is a bit grand sometimes, but some of that is stuff that is not as often said about white men, I would say. And I have to say, when I met her for the book, actually, a bit cool to start with. We had a long chat, and actually she was, I really warmed to her. And Ken
Can I just say that?
Yeah.
I did that quite a few times. I think I did that.
Yeah.
Andrew Neil's show.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And how did you find her on that?
Very different, really. Sometimes she could be dead friendly. Other times she could ignore you completely.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I never knew kind of who she was really. Because I was uninterested in the nuances of Labour. I think I'll probably be able to talk to her better now.
Yeah, no, she's complicated. I think it depends what mood you get. There's a thing I describe in the book where she was, there were big demonstrations in London when you remember Parliament was illegally kind of prorogued by Boris Johnson, and there was this whole kind of movement, Stop the Coup, which I, of course, found very exciting. These lefties on the street. And Diane Abbott was speaking at this kind of improvised, thing outside the Palace of Westminster. And I spotted her and I thought, without being too creepy, I'm going to slightly follow her through the crowd and see people how react to her. And she walked through the crowd to where she was going to speak. And people kept coming up to her. This is when Corbyn was still leader. And so she was Shadow Home Secretary. And people would sort of clap her on the back or say, Diane. And she just kind of tuned everyone out. She was just like, I'm going to make a speech. And at the time I thought, is this slightly haughty behaviour? But then, if you're a black woman who's received amazing amounts of abuse.
And I think that's something you talk, that people don't really think about enough, really, is that just, particularly all of them is what? Yeah. I've had a tiny bit of press abuse in my life. Yeah. That's why police protection a couple of times. Yeah. It's so profoundly disturbing.
Absolutely.
And it's nothing compared to what any of them have.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really, again, I've written about this in the book really determinedly because it's like you tot up the number of times there have been death threats, actual plots to assassinate.
I tried to kill, that's always treated like, there was all this bullshit over the vote about Gaza when that shitbag Lindsay Hoyle was talking about. He was so frightened.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody mentioned that a guy drove down from Cardiff, was it, to kill Jeremy.
Yeah, yeah.
And he killed somebody else.
Yeah, he drove into the crowd outside the mosque. Yeah, absolutely.
It's not like he was not a dangerous man, know.
Yeah, no,
that's never mentioned.
Yeah, and also I think that the death threats, and they have a subtle and an unsubtle effect. Obviously, the unsubtle effect, we can work that out. But the subtle effect is it says to you, if you're a voter, if you know that there's death threats against Corbyn, you might think, do I want him to be prime minister because bad shit might happen, even if I quite like him, And I think, there was a thing in, I think it was 2019, where there's some footage appeared on the internet of these soldiers using a poster of Corbyn for target practice in Afghanistan. And, it was slightly kind of laughed off like it's a bit of harmless fun. But it's like, actually, if you're someone who's not super political and you see this is effectively Jeremy Corbyn in front of a firing squad, then that might make you think, well, maybe a sort of centre-left government is better than a left-wing one because we don't want, So I think it's a way of policing, again, the sort of boundary of what's acceptable. And Benn particularly, there were endless death threats. Benn at one point was a minister under Wilson and got demoted from a job where he was quite important. And one of his kids came to tell Benn's wife, who was a school governor, and she was at a governor's meeting, and one of the kids turned up to say Dad's lost his job kind of thing. And Benn's wife, who was, radical, kind of quite a calm person, been dealing with this stuff for years, and she thought the child was coming to tell her that he'd been assassinated. That's what she thought. Yeah. So that's the level of, and I think in the sort of official history of British politics, this stuff is always like not mentioned, the level of threat against these politicians. And it's just recurrent every time, the stuff that happened to Benn, death threats, all this stuff about his health isn't strong enough for him to be prime minister, this whole playbook, he's mad, that was all used absolutely step by step against Corbyn as well. Exactly the same. It's like a playbook that they go through. And, who knows? But, I see Jeremy Corbyn occasionally on his bike and he looks pretty fit for someone who's in his mid-70s. And yet there were civil servants briefing the Tory press 5 or 6 years ago saying, oh no, he won't be able to stand the rigours of being prime minister, So this, again, part of the project of the book, I suppose, is to slightly call out these strategies that are used because they're always seen as just like a bit of a little footnote or, or too exotic to mention in serious history, or it's a joke. And I kind of think, some of it's bullshit. Death threats are not always real, but just lay it out there. And then people are like, oh, actually, this is, and as you say, there's endless focus now on threats to MPs. And I'm not belittling some of those threats, but some of those threats turn out to be some people with the Gaza placard standing outside the MP's office. Yeah. That's not quite the same as like Ulster loyalists trying to actually assassinate you or whatever.
Yeah. I suppose in the I don't know. Jeremy is sort of, at the end of your book, really, he's down and out, really. But I feel, having been working with him in this election, and that he's back.
Yeah. No, I think
Diane, I think would only have stayed in post because they were so fucking vile to her.
Yeah, and she said a thing to me that I think was maybe obvious but important. That's not said enough. And she just said, if you're someone like me who's a minority in every sense, just being there as long as possible has a kind of value,
right?
That it's so even an extra year, an extra 2 years, in that time, some black kid might see you on TV and think I could do that or whatever. Right. I'm being a bit pious about it, but I think that was her. But no, Corbyn, I think obviously there'll be a paper about my book, and I'm going to update the epilogue a little bit.
Right.
And I went to some of Corbyn's, campaign events and everything in the election just gone when he was standing as an independent. And it was really interesting. There was one on Highbury Fields, which is in his constituency, and you looked around who's at the event. And first of all, there were a lot of people there. And also, it was an absolute cross-section of who lives in Islington. There was like young black guys. There was like, quite wealthy-looking white guys. There were people from the estate around the corner. It was like a perfect cross-section. And then, surprise, surprise, he actually won quite comfortably.
Yeah.
So even if you don't completely share his politics, there's a powerful thing that he was doing then, and which I think he did as leader, which is to say kind of everyone should be represented by me. Whereas I think a lot of Labour politics under Starmer is kind of saying loads of these groups, we don't really need them. We just need the angry white men in
Look how that's dead.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, exactly. So
on day 3 of the
Corbyn, there's definitely, McDonnell's still an MP, so, and I was really interested in the election, how these people who were meant to be on their way out or totally unimportant actually dominated the news agenda for quite long stretches. Because I think with Diane Abbott, wasn't it interesting the way that they obviously tried to squeeze her out in such a cowardly way, and then a lot of showbiz people and all the rest of it were kicking up. And and Starmer, although he and his people are brutal, they basically had to back down. And even the Daily Mail, obviously in a totally cynical way, had an editorial calling her an iconic figure and all the rest of it, which on one level is kind of revolting.
Yeah.
But it was an interesting thing that suddenly people had to say these aging leftists actually have a value, and their stories have a value. It's interesting how a lot of younger people are very interested in that. As occasionally I'm doing events and I'll talk about the GLC, and afterwards you get a load of people come up to you who are like 25 who say, I'm studying the history of radical cities. Right. A lot of people involved in, like gay rights and stuff now are very interested rightly in all this stuff from then.
I suppose Ken, you talked to him, Ken got the most badly burned in a way, didn't he? I don't know whether there's a sort of elegiac quality when you interview him.
Yeah, there is, because I think in the sort of anti-Semitism crisis that was going on when Corbyn was leader, and then Livingstone said some things which I think were kind of unwise and offensive, but were not anti-Semitic.
No, but
my sense is that Corbyn essentially kind of panicked and was like, I need to just cut him adrift. Because Livingstone, if you spend much time talking to him, he's obsessed by the Second World War. And the reason he's obsessed by the Second World War is because his dad, who was an incredibly important person for him, was a merchant seaman and was a kind of war hero, a Tory as well, interestingly.
Yeah.
But Livingstone thinks that, the fight against the Nazis was a kind of incredibly proud moment for the left as well, and so when he starts talking about Hitler and all the rest of it in the context of anti-Semitism, it's the total opposite of him being anti-Semite. It's him actually, it's almost like his head is just full of all this drama about the Second World War. And so, but equally, I think if there's a Jewish journalist asking you awkward questions, I don't think it's okay to say, were you a Nazi? I don't think that's all right. So, but no, it is sort of tragic the way that things ended up for Livingstone in that way. Absolutely. And people I know who are Jewish, who will say, no, Corbyn's not an anti-Semite. Some of them will say Livingstone is.
Yeah.
And I don't agree with them, but it's uncomfortable to hear that and to have to almost argue the case. And so, I think with him, it is kind of sad. But I think he'll be seen historically as a pretty important person because as we're kind of discussing, it's like modern London, a lot of it is his creation. And you can see what happened when Johnson was running London in between, it was, everything was just allowed to.
Yeah.
So, that is sad. But the others, they're still, and I think Corbyn could end up representing Islington North and Independent for quite a while. Because he'll get re-elected.
Well, and I mean, my hope is that we're probably overly optimistic that he and, the other, that he forms the basis of some new kind of political formation.
Yeah, I mean, I hope, maybe this is important to put in the podcast at some point. I mean, I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I never have been. I mean, I vote Labour quite often, but, I guess the only reason I focus on the Labour Party is because I think in our electoral system and the history that's happened, this is where a lot of left stuff has happened. But I think, some people on the left outside the party have criticised my book and they said, oh, it's too much about, the Labour Party. It was like, well, unfortunately... But were there to be another more radical party, I think in lots of ways that would be a very good thing.
One of the interesting characters you're starting to hear more about in some ways, particularly in reference to McDonald, is Gramsci, the Italian political philosopher, I suppose, political activist.
Yeah.
So you would just tell us a bit more about Gramsci, really.
Well, Gramsci was, around his 20s and 30s and was sent to prison by the fascists essentially because his mind was seen as too dangerous. I think that's what the kind of magistrate said.
Yeah.
And Gramsci did a lot of thinking about how the left wins power without a revolution if it doesn't have the kind of revolutionary impetus. And he writes a lot about how the left can gradually spread its ideas and people through institutions. And McDonnell was a big Gramsci reader, still is. And I think a lot of maybe the subtlety of McDonnell's politics has often been, oh, well, how do I build alliances? So McDonnell, for example, was a big opponent of the expansion of Heathrow. And McDonnell would collaborate with people like Zach Goldsmith, the Tory, about that. Now, McDonnell would say to you, it's only on this one issue. But, what point do you collaborate? When does that become dangerers? When do you blur your politics?
Because I think the problem with working with, what's it called? It's the war of position.
There's a war of position, there's the war of manoeuvre.
So the war, which is which?
God, I'm going to get this wrong now, aren't I?
The war of position is where you infiltrate kind of state institutions.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the first one is the war of position is when you gradually build up the left strength through the government, but also through, the media, you gradually spread its ideas. And then the war of manoeuvre is when the revolutionary moment kind of comes and then you move quicker.
Occupy the phone.
And, I personally, I love Gramsci, but, if you're a cynic, you could say Gramsci is sometimes a way to rationalise the left not winning elections. He's like, oh,
that's a lovely line in your. There's a lovely line in your book, where you say sort of that, but yeah.
But I still think it's a really important insight because, like we've talked about the GLC and the way their ideas spread through society. The GLC was abolished, and so its ideas spread through culture, if you like, and through the way people actually lived and how they related to their neighbours and all these kind of subtle ways.
Yeah.
So Gramsci is really important, and I think that's why McDonnell, in some ways, is perhaps the most interesting politician in the book because he's thought really hard. If you're on the left and you're quite ideological like he is, how do you build alliances and how do you stop those alliances turning you into a kind of a mush as well?
Well, that's the problem is if you infiltrate institutions, then if you change the institutions also change you.
Yeah, exactly. But I think...
And they're adept at doing that.
Yeah, especially in Britain. Absolutely. They're very good at, and
Parliament gets you involved in all that
absolutely.
Nonsense.
And how do you work between Parliament and outside Parliament? And I think particularly McDonnell and to a lesser extent maybe Corbyn thought pretty hard about this, and Livingstone as well is interesting about this. So Livingstone's argument would be, and probably McDonnell's too, you want to have some people in Parliament and some people outside.
Yes.
So the people in Parliament can say, look, you need to give us this because look at all those people outside.
Yes.
And those people outside can think, oh, we've got some people in the building who've got House of Commons headed paper and they've got that.
Yeah.
And it's like that kind of, and I think that's, to me, quite a persuasive way of doing more radical politics. You need both, and something Corbyn said to me at one point when I was saying, how did you cope as a backbencher all those years? He was like, you're in Parliament, you've got the headed paper, you've got the status. So even if you're very marginal, that's incredibly encouraging to some, Chilean activist group or some anti-roads activist group, because they can get in the building, you can give them information, they've got a guy or a woman inside. So I think that Gramscian idea about gradually spreading, I think it's persuasive. And maybe that's the way to overcome some of these boundaries that are put on the left, because Gramscian war of position stuff often happens almost without enemies realising. It really makes me laugh that I work a lot in the British Library, and the reading room I work in, all the right-wing papers are there, and I read them, for my day job to just check what's going on. And if you read like the Telegraph, on the front page and the editorial pages, it's all about, the evils of wokeness and all the rest of it. But then they have a section where they have stuff about weddings. And I remember reading one where it was like a description of a wedding, almost like a sort of Hello magazine talking about a wedding. And it was this wedding in Hackney with people having, vegan food and, men wearing trousers slightly too short and all the rest of it. And I was thinking, on the editorial page, you're railing against this stuff, but on the wedding page, you're kind of losing. Yeah. And that felt like a little tiny Gramscian victory that, and you see that in The Sun and so on, that,
yes,
those papers are, they still do lots of vile stuff, but in, maybe their pop music coverage or whatever, they're probably much less homophobic than they would have been 30 years ago, so you can sort of see, I think, the creep of some of these ideas, which I see as positive, through even the nastiest. And it doesn't mean those battles are over, because, we see now the far right are running around, running amok.
Yeah.
But again, this is a whole other topic. I think some of the anger from the far right is because there's a note of panic in it, I think. It's like, actually, maybe we're, on some level, we're kind of losing. I'm not in any way justifying what they're doing, but I think, and some of the anti-woke kind of tirades that you get in the right-wing press feels a bit panicky. I don't think in the 80s you needed to say, wokeness or the 80s equivalent is taking over, because you knew at that point only 20 or 30% of people had those values. But now it's, 40%, 50%. Maybe in cities it's bigger, younger people, these values are quite common. So I do think that kind of Gramscian picture of how these things gradually sort of seep through institutions and also people change their behaviours almost without realising it. My dad was in the army, and he was never a right-wing guy, but he was quite senior in the army, and then he retired. And my dad was a kind of social conservative. And yet by the time, the last few years of his life, my dad would be like, gay marriage, of course, gay people should get married. Whereas I bet if I'd asked him in the 60s, my dad would have said being gay was quite wrong, And my dad probably never had a moment where he thought, ooh, I agree with the GLC. But on some sort of subtle level, through things he read or people he met or whatever, he just thought a prejudice just kind of fell away. And I guess it would be better maybe if the left got somewhere through, revolutions or elections. But if you can't have those things, or not as often as you'd like, then maybe the Gramscian kind of seepage.
Some of the shit. Yeah. The trouble is, though, then you get like the most reactionary member, the Conservative candidate for leadership is Kemi Badenoch.
I know.
He's black.
I know.
And a lot of those gay MPs, Labour and Conservative,
absolutely,
are horrible, poisonous.
No, it's not. Absolutely, these are not neat. And if you're very cynical about what's happened in the Conservative Party with the sort of greater racial diversity, you could say essentially the message that sends is, well, if you're black, if you're really right wing, you can be prime minister, but if you're black and left wing, forget it. So it's still quite potentially putting a boundary around. But absolutely, it's not simple. And I think one of the fascinating things with the GLC was it was abolished. And obviously that was wrong. But if it hadn't been abolished, would some of the things that Livingstone was doing have generated sort of more internal frictions? Would it, if it had lasted longer, would the whole experiment, I think it still would have done a lot of good things, but maybe the contradictions would have come out more.
Right.
But because it was only 5 years of it, these things were not, they never became destructive, those sort of internal tensions. But you're right. I'm not trying to argue that everyone in Britain is like a left liberal person at all, but I would argue there are more left liberal people now than there were when I was a kid. And that has come about, I think, partly in a sort of unacknowledged kind of way. Because also the way that social change happens, I think, is that a certain minority behave in a certain way, and that behaviour maybe gradually spreads. But if you have an election based around, should gay men have equal rights with straight men, for a long time you'll lose that election. So it's almost, if you're a lot of these questions, I'm in favour of democracy, but they can't necessarily be resolved by kind of referendums or whatever, because you always got to let politics move and move and move, and then maybe you have some kind of vote. And I think that some of the people in the book who are smarter, like Ken Livingstone, they realised we can't do a GLC for the whole country in the 80s, but maybe in London we can do this. There's enough votes here to make it work. Local government, even though it seems so boring from the outside, a lot of the people in the book were very involved because they were like, hang on, we can just get into a little borough where the electoral turnout's quite low, get our mates to all vote, and then we're running the show.
Yeah.
Whereas in a general election, you're dealing with the Daily Mail, and all the rest of it. In a local election, the local paper might think a radical left council is exciting. And they're not. So it's, although a lot of people in the book are quite idealistic, some of them are quite worldly about power. And I think not all of them, but some of them. And I think that's maybe something the book is also trying to get at is, on the left, when do you have to think about maximising your power rather than going into battle and just being slaughtered like in 2019? How do we find ways to kind of,
I mean, one area that we haven't touched on, I suppose, and maybe we might as well cover it, is the internationalism, where in a sense the left is still very much on the back foot, really, isn't it? To anti-colonialism, and particularly now with the genocide. We're not winning that one, really. Or maybe we are, I don't know.
Winning it in terms of actually stopping the genocide. And it's incredibly depressing, isn't it? Because you've got a president like Biden in America who, Biden, I don't have his politics, but I thought he's going to be a relatively left of centre Democrat as president and has been in some ways. And yet on Gaza, he's been, as bad as you could imagine.
I think Trump,
So,
and Kamala Harris will be the same.
That is, and again, I think one of the reasons why particularly Corbyn had to be destroyed from the point of view was because he would have had a foreign policy that would have been quite different. And that was not, it was interesting, wasn't it, when Robin Cook, who doesn't really feature in the book, because he's not as radical, but when he was foreign secretary under Blair briefly, and he wanted to do his kind of ethical foreign policy, in some ways he was a little bit naive, but, I know this from my other job, that Robin Cook was essentially destroyed by civil servants in the Foreign Office because they were like, we're not having a foreign secretary who's going to stop arms sales to dictatorships. Cook was, even in a milder way, was trying to make the foreign policy of Britain a bit more like maybe the foreign policy.
I saw Adam Bolton being interviewed, and he was saying, he just said under his breath almost, why do people, why people complain about Gaza when, it literally makes no difference what position Britain has. And I said, if that was true, why did the fucking Israel lobby work so hard to get rid of Corbyn? It's only because it would have been amazingly important.
No, absolutely. That's quite clear. And also, we know, don't we, that, a lot of people who are stuck in Gaza, if they're able to, they see a couple 100,000 people in Trafalgar Square, and that's very important to them. That's not just like, who cares about these people? So, but no, absolutely, that foreign policy, the boundaries are policed even more tightly than they are in domestic policy, and you're absolutely right. And I think that if you're in favour of getting rid of nuclear weapons, or no longer intervening militarily all over the world or whatever, you really are a threat. And I think that has to be. And I think Corbyn definitely got the sharp end of that. The establishment.
There's an interesting thing happening. This week and last week, in that people, especially the Guardian, in a way that with the elections in Venezuela, they're saying, Maduro was lost and he's not. And I would believe that if they hadn't already tried this before with somebody called Guaido,
that's
who
right.
had no authority before, but yet the Guardian and the United States said, this is the president. This is the legitimate president of Venezuela. Is this guy? And so I'm not saying that Maduro is perfect. But I'm very suspicious.
I agree. I think that's right. That there were various coups, weren't there, attempted against Maduro and also against Chavez, and they were backed by all kinds of supposedly right-thinking centrist people. So I think that's right. And also, I write in the book about Chile and the government, because that government was a massive influence. It was, as I'm sure everyone knows, was a kind of left-wing government that was elected and didn't have a secret police and was at pains to govern in a kind of liberal way, although it was quite a radical government. And then ultimately Pinochet overthrew it in a coup.
That's that great. It is, in a way, the way as a left-wing leader you would want to go out is that last photo of Allende.
Yeah.
Where he's got like, I mean, he's not wearing it. He's got a steel helmet.
Yeah,
on,
that's right. Yeah.
And in his hand, he's got an AK given to him by Fidel Castro.
Yeah.
And he's going out there to be shot down with his AK.
Yeah, it's a pretty good year. In the era of social media, that would be a pretty big, But, I think the Andy government is kind of amazing government, and I'm generally not in favour of authoritarian governments. But, one of the criticisms of Andy from the left was you were too liberal. And if you'd like arrested...
Talking to somebody on the demo on Saturday, some trotter was saying exactly.
Yeah, if you'd arrested these generals, then you would have been all right. And I think Maduro, I've got less time for, but I think with Chavez, certainly there's a kind of critique, isn't there, in the West to be like, you weren't a perfect Democrat. Well, it's like, the opposition newspapers were saying every single day you should be more violently overthrown.
Yeah, and it wasn't, 75% of everything in Venezuela was privately owned. The supermarkets were conspiring against him.
Yeah, exactly.
Media.
Exactly. And I think I think some liberals, we could call them, have a sort of naivety about the left and illiberalism, that they think the left is often illiberal, which it can be, but then they sort of forget that the right is all the time. And often left leaders face these pressures, which mean that, if a newspaper is saying your government should be overthrown and you should be shot, should that newspaper be allowed to publish that? That's a complex question, isn't it, at best? And although the people I've written about this time, I think were all pretty immaculately kind of liberal in their view of civil liberties, I think it frustrates me. Yeah, you'll get people making these critiques of left leaders around the world, and you're like, well, and also the argument is also made that these people on the left have some allies who are unsavoury characters. It was used against Corbyn. Here you are on a march with some, Islamic social conservatives or whatever. And you're like, have you actually ever been on a demo? If you go on a demo, there are always people there you don't 100% agree with. That's what demos are. Yeah. And people will make that criticism. And people who criticise, Corbyn or Benn or whatever, are often they themselves people who supported the Iraq War or whatever. So hang on, you were supporting a sort of far-right American president, and yet you're calling out Corbyn for spending 30 seconds in the room with someone from Hamas. And you're like, so there's a kind of double standard, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So, Andy Beckett, if you want to remind us the name of the book and plug it.
The book is called The Searchers, 5 Rebels, Their Dream of a Different Britain and Their Many Enemies.
Available now. You're going to do a paperback. When's that coming out?
Paperback, I think, in May, maybe around May Day next year, which could be an appropriate time. But with a few little updates, but not that much. But hopefully the paperback. Also, I always think paperbacks are the real book, really, aren't they? The hardbacks are like the presentation edition. So hopefully the paperback, that'll be a nice thing. And we'll see if it annoys a few more centrists.
Always a good thing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy Beckett.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so that was. I think it was a really fascinating talk. He's a really interesting guy. I think I've met him once or twice before, and his writings in the Guardian are also worth reading. Which a lot of that paper isn't, but some of it is. So Andy Beckett is a serious interlude between comedians. Next time we have got Sir Lenny Henry. What a scoop. And after that, we've got Ben McIntyre, the journalist and author of Operation Mincemeat and many other Second World War books.
Yeah, if you want a bit of homework, you can read his new book. If it's not out already, it'll be out in the next few days. It's called The Siege.
Yeah.
And it's about the Iranian embassy siege.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking to him in a couple episodes' time.
Superb. All right. Let's go. Bye-bye. You've been listening to the Alexei podcast. This show is produced and edited by Talal Karkuti. Music by Tarbush Records. Thanks to Audio Boom for hosting us. Please keep your emails coming in at alexeisaylepodcast@gmail.com. Goodbye.